Welcome to the deep dive. We're diving into API architecture today with the book Mastering API Architecture.
Oh, a great choice.
It really is. And we've got three experts behind this book: James Goff, a distinguished engineer at Morgan Stanley and a Java champion;
Wow.
Daniel Bryant, head of developer relations at Ambassador Labs, also a Java champion;
Impressive.
and Matthew Auburn, a VP at Morgan Stanley with a deep background in API security.
They really know their stuff.
They do, and they cover a lot of ground, from design and operation to how these systems evolve. So buckle up, it's going to be a great deep dive.
Sounds good. I'm ready.
Now, we both know a bit about APIs already, but what I found really interesting in this book was how they differentiate between internal and external APIs.
Oh, interesting.
It's not just about different software talking to each other, right? It's about understanding the different ways they need to communicate.
Makes sense.
And they illustrate this perfectly with a case study about modernizing a conference system.
Okay, I'm listening.
So they break down how extracting the attendee functionality into its own service impacts both internal communication with the legacy system and external interactions with a call for papers platform.
So you're saying internal and external APIs have different considerations.
Exactly. I love how they use this real-world example to make those differences crystal clear. It's like internal APIs are all about speed and efficiency, right?
Yeah, makes sense.
While external APIs need to be more standardized and robust to accommodate all those different systems out there.
Ah, I see. Like different levels of formality.
Yes. And that leads perfectly into the next big topic, the age-old debate, REST versus RPC.
Or more specifically, gRPC, right?
Exactly. So many people assume one is just better, but this book does a fantastic job of explaining the strengths and weaknesses of each approach.
I like that kind of balanced perspective.
Right. So for external APIs, the ones that need to be widely accessible and understood,
Yeah.
REST or representational state transfer is often the go-to choice.
The common language of the web.
Exactly. It's flexible and well-supported, making it easier for diverse systems to integrate.
But it can be a bit chatty at times, right?
Yes, that's one of the drawbacks they point out. With REST, you often need multiple back-and-forth exchanges to get things done.
And that's where gRPC comes in.
Precisely. gRPC, or Google Remote Procedure Call, is designed for internal high-performance scenarios.
Where efficiency is key.
Exactly. It's like having a direct line of communication between services, cutting down on all that back and forth.
Makes sense.
I like to think of it as gRPC being the dedicated fiber optic cable for speed, while REST is more like sending letters back and forth.
I love that analogy. Both get the job done, but one is definitely faster.
Right. And the book also mentions GraphQL briefly, but it's worth noting.
Especially for those situations where clients only need specific pieces of data.
It's like ordering a la carte instead of having to sift through a whole buffet.
Perfect analogy.
Now, once you've decided on your API style, let's talk about designing those APIs effectively.
Okay, design is key.
Absolutely. And the book really emphasizes the importance of the Open API specification, or OAS.
Oh yeah, OAS is crucial.
It's not just about writing code, it's about creating a clear blueprint, a contract, if you will, for how your API should function.
A shared understanding.
Exactly. Think of OAS as a detailed document that outlines everything about your API, what data it accepts, what responses it produces, all the nitty-gritty detail.
Like a comprehensive instruction manual.
Yes. And what's even better is that OAS goes beyond just documentation. It can actually help you automate all sorts of tasks.
Like what?
Generating client code, for example, or creating mock APIs for testing. And it can even flag potential breaking changes before they cause problems.
Wow, that's powerful.
It is. Those are huge time savers for any development team.
I can see why they highlight it so much.
And what I appreciated was that they didn't just stop at OAS. They brought in the Microsoft REST API guidelines as well.
Oh, interesting. Bringing in perspectives from outside their own world.
Exactly. It shows that learning from diverse sources, even potential competitors, can lead to better API designs.
It's about taking the best practices from across the industry.
Right. And speaking of best practices, once you've got your API designed and your OAS in place, what comes next?
Testing. You can't forget testing.
Absolutely. And this book dives deep into the different layers of testing.
Because you wouldn't build a bridge without testing its strength first, right?
Exactly. They cover unit testing, service testing, component testing, contract testing, and end-to-end testing.
A comprehensive approach.
Yes. And what really stood out to me was their emphasis on contract testing. especially in a world dominated by microservices.
Oh yeah, contract testing is crucial in that context.
Because it's not enough to just test individual services in isolation.
You need to make sure they can actually talk to each other.
Right, like honoring their agreed-upon contracts.
And they specifically highlight consumer-driven contract testing, right?
Yes. Where the consumers of the API, not just the provider, have a say in defining what they need.
It's a much more collaborative approach.
Exactly. It ensures that the API actually meets the needs of its users. And they even mention some popular frameworks like Pact and Spring Cloud contracts.
To help automate that process.
Exactly. Now, speaking of managing interactions, we can't talk about APIs without discussing API gateways.
The gatekeepers.
Yes. They act as that central traffic cop for all those incoming requests.
Managing the flow.
Imagine an API gateway as the grand central station of your API ecosystem.
Okay, I can picture that.
It handles everything, from routing requests to the appropriate services to enforcing security policies to providing observability into your API traffic.
A lot of responsibility.
It is. And the book breaks down the different types of gateways available, from those enterprise-grade solutions to lightweight microservices gateways.
So there are options to fit different needs.
Exactly. But one thing they emphasize is making sure your API gateway doesn't become a single point of failure.
Right, that's a classic architectural pitfall.
It is. It's like having one main entrance to a stadium, right? If it gets blocked, everyone's stuck.
So redundancy and failover mechanisms are essential.
Absolutely. Now, API gateways handle external traffic, but what about all the communication happening between those microservices within our system?
Ah, the internal workings.
That's where service mesh comes in.
Managing the internal traffic.
Precisely. It's specifically designed to manage that complex web of interactions between microservices.
Keeping things running smoothly.
Yes, especially in a distributed environment. And, a lot of people might wonder, why do we even need a service mesh? Can't those services just talk to each other directly?
It seems simpler that way.
Right. But that's where the book's reference to the 8 fallacies of distributed computing comes in handy.
Oh yeah, those fallacies are classic.
They highlight all those common assumptions developers make about distributed systems. Assumptions that can lead to major headaches down the line.
Like assuming the network is always reliable.
Exactly. Or that latency is negligible or bandwidth is infinite.
Those fallacies remind us that the real world of distributed systems is messy.
And unpredictable. And Service Mesh tackles those challenges head on.
By providing that dedicated infrastructure for inter-service communication.
Ensuring reliability, security, and observability, even in the face of those fallacies.
So it's about building a more resilient system.
Exactly. One that can handle the complexities of the real world.
And they discuss different approaches to implementing a service mesh, right?
Yes. Using libraries, sidecar proxies, or even proxyless frameworks.
Each with its own trade-offs.
Absolutely. Choosing the right approach depends on your specific needs and the complexity of your system.
And they mention some popular implementations like Istio, Linkerd, and Consul.
All great options with robust features for managing traffic and security.
It's amazing how much thought goes into designing these systems.
It is. And all of that leads us to another key point that the book emphasizes.
Which is?
Using APIs as building blocks for a flexible and adaptable architecture.
Oh yeah, that's crucial.
It's not about creating a monolithic system that's difficult to change.
It's about designing for evolution.
Exactly. Modularity and flexibility are key.
And they dive into concepts like cohesion and coupling, right?
Yes. Those are fundamental for building a well-structured and maintainable system.
Remind me, what's the difference again?
High cohesion means that the elements within a module or service are closely related, working towards a common goal.
Okay, and loose coupling.
Loose coupling means that the modules are independent, so changes in one have minimal impact on others.
Ah, right. Keeping things separate but connected.
Precisely. And those principles are essential for building systems that can adapt to new requirements over time.
And they provide some practical guidance on achieving that, right?
Yes. They discuss design patterns like facade, adapter, and even the strangler fig pattern.
Strangler fig pattern. That sounds interesting.
It is. It's a fascinating approach to modernizing legacy systems.
So?
It's like gradually replacing an old tree by growing a new one around it until the old one eventually withers away.
Ah, I see. Gradually phasing out the old with the new.
Exactly. It's a way to modernize incrementally, minimizing disruption and risk.
And they argue that this evolutionary approach is often much safer than a massive rewrite.
Absolutely. Now, with cloud migration being such a hot topic these days.
Yeah, everyone's moving to the cloud.
I'm curious about how APIs factor into that process.
Because they seem essential for bridging the gap between legacy systems and the cloud, right?
You hit the nail on the head. APIs provide that abstraction layer.
Shielding us from the complexities of the underlying infrastructure.
Exactly. Making it easier to move services to the cloud without having to rewrite them from scratch.
Like those universal travel adapters that let you plug in your devices anywhere in the world.
Perfect analogy. And the book outlines different cloud migration approaches like rehosting, replatforming, and refactoring.
Each with its own level of effort and complexity.
Right, rehosting is the simplest approach.
Like lifting and shifting your API to the cloud as is.
Yeah, it gets you there quickly.
But you might not be taking full advantage of all the cloud features.
Exactly. Then there's replatforming, which is like tweaking things to leverage some cloud-specific features.
And finally, refactoring, which is a more comprehensive redesign.
Creating a truly cloud-native API.
So the right approach depends on your specific goals and constraints.
Absolutely. And the book stresses the importance of careful planning before diving into any migration project.
Understanding those cloud-specific considerations.
Now, we've touched on security throughout our conversation.
Security is always top of mind.
And I know the book goes even deeper into zero trust security in the context of the cloud.
Oh yeah, zero trust is crucial in a cloud environment.
Why is that? What makes it so important?
Well, think about it. Cloud environments are inherently more open and distributed than traditional on-premises setups.
With resources scattered everywhere.
Exactly. So that old notion of a secure perimeter just doesn't cut it anymore.
It's like trying to secure a city with a single wall.
It just doesn't work in today's complex world.
So zero trust takes a completely different approach.
Assuming that no user or device is trustworthy by default.
Regardless of their location.
Exactly. It's about verifying every request, every access attempt, no matter where it originates.
So we're moving from trust but verify to never trust, always verify.
Precisely. A much more rigorous approach to security.
And that requires a comprehensive strategy, right?
Absolutely. Strong authentication, authorization mechanisms, network segmentation, data encryption, continuous threat monitoring, the whole 9 yards.
Okay, so how do we actually put this zero trust model into practice for our APIs in the cloud?
That's where things get really interesting.
Yeah.
And we'll delve into those specifics after a short break.
So zero trust is all about verifying every single request no matter what.
Right. It's about implementing really solid authentication and authorization.
And things like network segmentation and data encryption.
All of those things, they make it much harder for attackers to get in, even if they do manage to breach one part of your system.
And the book goes into how API gateways are really key for this.
Oh, definitely. They're like the first line of defense for your API ecosystem.
They can handle all that authentication and authorization stuff.
And also things like rate limiting.
To prevent those denial of service attacks.
Exactly. And even some threat detection, to identify and block suspicious activity.
It's amazing how much they can do.
It's like having a really good security guard at the front door.
Making sure only the right people get in. And then once they're in, Service Mesh steps up to provide that granular level of security between all those microservices.
Like a security patrol roaming around inside.
Making sure that even those internal interactions are secure.
It's a multi-layered approach to security.
And what I found interesting was this concept of shared responsibility in the cloud.
Oh yeah, that's a really important point.
It's not just about relying on the cloud provider to handle everything.
We as users have a big role to play too.
Right. It's like sharing an apartment building. The landlord is responsible for the building's security, but we're responsible for our own apartments.
We need to make sure our own doors are locked, and we're following those basic security practices.
It's a partnership.
And the book emphasizes that we need to understand the security tools and services our cloud provider offers.
Because they give us a ton of features.
From identity and access management to encryption and threat detection.
But it's up to us to learn how to use them effectively.
Exactly. We can't just assume the cloud provider will handle everything for us.
We need to be proactive and take ownership of our part of the security equation.
Right. It's a shared responsibility.
Now, beyond security, I know there are other cloud-specific considerations when it comes to API design.
Like what?
Well, one of the biggest ones is cost optimization.
Oh yeah, the cloud can be expensive if you're not careful.
It's like having access to an all-you-can-eat buffet.
It's tempting to pile your plate high.
But you'll end up paying for all that food whether you eat it or not.
That's a great analogy.
Yeah.
And the book talks about strategies for managing costs.
Monitoring your resource utilization, choosing the right pricing models, optimizing your API design.
All of those things can help keep costs under control.
It's about being mindful of the resources we're using and making sure we're getting the most bang for our buck.
Efficiency is key.
And the book goes even deeper, covering things like networking and storage, monitoring and logging, all those crucial aspects of running APIs in the cloud.
It's a comprehensive guide.
It is. And what I found really helpful was their discussion of the different approaches to migrating APIs to the cloud.
Rehosting, replatforming, and refactoring.
It made it clear that there's no one-size-fits-all solution.
Right. The best approach depends on a lot of factors.
Your existing architecture, your budget, your timeline, your desired level of cloud integration.
Rehosting is the simplest, like just picking up your API and moving it to the cloud.
It's quick, but you might not be fully leveraging the cloud's capabilities.
Then there's replatforming, which involves making some changes to take advantage of cloud-specific features.
And finally, refactoring, which is a more involved redesign to create a truly cloud-native API.
So it's a spectrum of options.
From simple lift and shift to complete transformation.
And the key is to choose the right level of change for your specific needs.
Now, we've talked about established cloud providers, but what about this whole edge computing thing?
Edge computing, yeah, that's changing the game.
It feels like we're moving from a centralized model of computing to a more distributed one, right?
Exactly. Pushing those cloud capabilities out to the edges of the network.
Closer to the users and devices that need them.
So instead of all the data having to travel back and forth to a central cloud data center,
we're pushing some of that processing and storage out to the edges.
which brings a whole host of benefits.
Like what?
Well, first and foremost, reduce latency.
Because the data doesn't have to travel as far.
Right. So you get much faster response times, which is crucial for certain applications.
Like gaming or video streaming.
Exactly. Anything that requires real-time responsiveness.
And then there's improved reliability.
Because you're distributing your processing and data storage across multiple edge locations.
So if one location goes down,
The others can pick up the slack.
like having multiple backup generators.
Exactly. And this distributed nature also helps with scalability,
You can easily add more edge locations as needed.
without having to over-provision your central cloud resources.
So it's a more flexible and cost-effective way to scale.
Definitely.
But I imagine edge computing also introduces new challenges for API architecture.
Oh, absolutely. One of the biggest ones is managing the complexity of this distributed environment.
Because now you're dealing with APIs running on potentially hundreds or even thousands of edge locations.
And you need to be able to deploy, monitor, and secure those APIs consistently across that entire network.
It's like going from managing a single bookstore to managing a nationwide chain of bookstores.
You need completely different systems and processes to handle that scale.
So what are some of the solutions?
Well, the book talks about the importance of automation, orchestration, and centralized management platforms.
To help us wrangle all that complexity.
You need tools that can automate the deployment of your APIs to all those edge locations,
And tools that can give you a unified view of their performance and health.
and tools that can help you enforce those security policies consistently.
So it's about using technology to help us manage this distributed world.
Exactly. And it's also about shifting our mindset.
How so?
We need to start thinking about APIs as being distributed by nature.
Designed from the ground up to operate in these edge environments. Now let's talk about the data, because that seems like a big challenge with edge computing.
Oh, absolutely. With data potentially being stored and processed in multiple locations, you need to make sure it stays consistent.
So how do we do that?
Well, the book talks about data replication and synchronization.
Making sure that changes in one location are reflected in the others.
Exactly. And using appropriate technologies to handle that.
And having robust data validation and conflict resolution mechanisms in place.
To deal with any inconsistencies that might crop up.
It's a lot to think about.
It is. But the benefits of edge computing can be significant.
Especially for those applications that need low latency, high reliability, and localized data processing.
Right, those are the use cases where edge computing really shines.
Now, the book also touches on some emerging technologies in the API space.
Like HTTP3 and platform-based service mesh.
What are those all about?
Well, HTTP3 is the latest version of the protocol that powers the web.
The foundation of the internet.
And it brings a lot of performance improvements for API-driven applications.
Faster data transfer, better efficiency, all that good stuff.
Exactly. And then there's platform-based service mesh, which is basically bringing service mesh capabilities directly into cloud platforms.
Making it easier to adopt and manage.
So it's becoming more integrated into the cloud infrastructure itself.
So it seems like the world of API architecture is constantly evolving.
Oh, absolutely. There's always something new on the horizon.
And the book encourages us to embrace that change and keep learning.
To stay curious and experiment with new technologies.
To be at the forefront of innovation.
Exactly. It's an exciting field to be in.
It is. So as we wrap up this deep dive, what are your final thoughts for our listener?
Well, I hope they come away from this understanding that API architecture is more than just a technical topic.
It's about building connections.
It's about enabling communication and collaboration between systems, applications, and people.
It's about creating a more interconnected world.
And mastering API architecture is a journey of continuous learning and adaptation.
Embracing the ever-changing landscape of technology.
And ultimately, it's about using these connections to solve problems and create value.
Beautifully said. To our listener, if you're looking to make a real impact in the world of technology, diving deeper into API architecture is an incredible path to take.
It's a challenging but rewarding field.
And remember, the future of technology is being built on these connections, and you have the opportunity to be a part of it.
So go out there and build something amazing.
We were talking about how edge computing really changes how we think about API architecture.
The whole different ballgame, right?
It feels like we're moving from this centralized model of computing
To a much more distributed one.
pushing those cloud capabilities out to the very edges of the network.
Closer to the users and devices where the action is happening.
So instead of everything having to go back and forth to a central cloud data center,
We're distributing the processing and storage?
which makes a lot of sense, especially for applications that need really fast response times.
Exactly. Things like gaming, video streaming, IoT devices, all those real-time use cases.
But I imagine it also brings a whole new set of challenges.
Oh, absolutely. Managing all those APIs spread out across all those edge locations, that's not easy.
It sounds like a logistical nightmare.
It can be. You got to think about deployment, monitoring, security, all those things become much more complex.
So how do we even begin to tackle that complexity?
Well, the book talks about the need for automation, orchestration, and centralized management platforms.
Okay, so leveraging technology to help us manage this distributed world.
Exactly. You need tools that can automate the deployment of your APIs to all those different edge locations.
And tools that can give you a unified view of how those APIs are performing, whether there are any issues.
And of course, tools to help you enforce those security policies consistently across the entire edge network.
It's a lot to keep track of.
It is. But the right tools can make a huge difference.
Now let's talk about data, because that seems like a really tricky aspect of edge computing.
It is. With data potentially being stored and processed in multiple places, you need to make sure it stays consistent.
So how do we prevent those inconsistencies?
Well, the book dives into strategies for data replication and synchronization.
Making sure that if you update data in one location, those changes are reflected in all the other locations.
Exactly. And choosing the right technologies and mechanisms to handle that synchronization process.
And having ways to detect and resolve any conflicts that might arise.
Because conflicts are bound to happen in a distributed environment.
It's like having multiple copies of a book in different libraries.
Right. If someone checks out a book in one library, the others need to know about it.
To keep their records accurate.
And avoid any confusion.
So managing data in this edge world requires a lot of careful planning.
Definitely. But the payoff can be huge, especially for those applications that benefit from low latency, high reliability, and localized data processing.
So edge computing might be more complex, but it opens up a whole new world of possibilities.
Absolutely.
Now, before we wrap up, the book also touches on some really interesting emerging technologies in the API space.
Like HTTP3 and platform-based service mesh.
What are those all about?
Well, HTTP3 is like the next generation of the protocol that powers the web, the thing that makes the internet work.
The foundation of everything.
And it's designed to make things faster and more efficient, especially for API-driven applications.
So it's a big deal for anyone working with APIs.
It is. And then there's platform-based service mesh, which is basically integrating service mesh capabilities directly into cloud platforms.
Making it easier to adopt and manage.
Right. It's becoming a core part of the cloud infrastructure like we saw with Kubernetes.
So it seems like the API landscape is constantly evolving.
Oh, absolutely. There are always new technologies and approaches emerging.
Which is exciting, but also a bit daunting, right? Trying to keep up with everything.
It can be. But the key is to stay curious, to keep learning, to experiment with new things.
To be a lifelong learner, basically.
Exactly. And the book really emphasizes that, the importance of continuous learning and adaptation.
Because the world of technology never stands still.
Right. If you're not moving forward, you're falling behind.
So true. So as we wrap up this deep dive into API architecture, what are your final thoughts for our listener?
Well, what I hope people take away from this is that APIs are much more than just technical components.
They're not just lines of code.
They're the building blocks of our digital world. They shape how we interact with technology and with each other.
They're the bridges that connect everything.
Exactly. And mastering API architecture is about understanding those connections. It's about being able to build those bridges.
It's about solving problems, creating value, and ultimately making a real impact in the world.
Well said.
To our listener, if you're fascinated by the power of technology, if you're driven to create and innovate, I encourage you to delve deeper into the world of API architecture.
It's a journey full of challenges and rewards.
It's a chance to be at the forefront of innovation.
And it's an opportunity to shape the future of technology.
So thank you for joining us on this deep dive, and until next time, happy building.